What would you do if you were arrested by the police, only to reveal you're not just an ordinary person? That's exactly what happened when a routine traffic stop turned into something much bigger. A black CIA agent, dressed casually and minding his own business, got pulled over by an overzealous officer who had no idea who he was dealing with. The officer, thinking he was just another suspect, quickly made the decision to arrest him. But what happened next? Well, let's just say karma had something to say. Just 10 minutes after that arrest, the tables completely turned, and the officer's world was about to come crashing down. This is a story of judgment, power, and how things can quickly unravel when you're not careful about who you mess with. Stay tuned to find out how this intense moment unfolded and the shocking twist that followed. The CIA agent, who we'll call James, had been in countless dangerous situations, but never like this. As he sat in the back of the police car, trying to remain calm, his mind raced. How could this officer be so reckless? James had been on undercover missions in some of the most volatile parts of the world, but now he was being treated like a common criminal, simply because of his appearance. He kept his cool, knowing how to handle a bad situation, but the officer wasn't backing down. He kept making assumptions, asking questions, and even mocking James' answers, unaware of who he truly was. Meanwhile, James' thoughts began to wander. Could this officer's actions be driven by racial bias, or was it something deeper? As the tension mounted, James knew he had to stay focused. Something big was about to happen, but neither of them had any idea how quickly things would spiral out of control. James kept his hands folded in his lap, doing everything he could to stay composed. The hum of the police car's engine seemed to echo in his mind as he replayed the scene in his head. The officer had been so quick to judge him. He could feel the weight of the officer's assumptions, the anger in his voice, and the sharp tone of every word. But there was something else, something nagging at him. Was this just an isolated incident, or was there a pattern here? As they pulled into the station, James glanced out the window, searching for any sign of recognition. He hoped someone, anyone, would realize who he was, but no one did. Instead, he was led into a small interrogation room, the cold walls closing in on him. The officer, still acting as if he had all the power, stood by the door, eager to assert control. Back at the precinct, Officer Matthews, the one who had arrested James, was getting anxious. He wasn't the type to back down from a confrontation, but something about this case didn't sit right. He'd seen criminals before, but James, there was something about him that didn't add up. Matthews kept thinking about the way James had remained calm, unshaken, even in the face of arrest. It made him feel uneasy. His gut told him there was more to this than he realized, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Meanwhile, James sat in the cold room, his mind working faster than ever. He knew the longer this dragged on, the harder it would be to clear up the misunderstanding. He wasn't just an agent. He was someone with connections, someone with power. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that revealing his true identity right now could make things even worse. He needed to think, plan his next move carefully, or everything could backfire. The clock was ticking. Minutes turned to hours, and still no one had come to speak to James. The small room felt like it was closing in on him. He could hear the muffled voices in the hall outside, but it was all a blur, just white noise compared to the tension building in his own mind. He kept replaying every detail of the arrest, every word the officer had said. Something was off about this whole situation. Why hadn't anyone come to verify his identity? Why hadn't anyone questioned the arrest? The uncertainty gnawed at him. Officer Matthews, on the other hand, was getting more agitated by the second. His partner had just gotten back from checking James' car, and the news wasn't good. There was no sign of any wrongdoing or any criminal activity. Nothing that explained why Matthews had felt so sure about arresting him in the first place. The more Matthews thought about it, the more his own instincts betrayed him. This wasn't just a simple case of mistaken identity. This felt personal, like he had made a serious mistake, but he couldn't understand why or how. Suddenly, the door to the interrogation room opened. Matthews stepped in, his face tense. Without saying a word, he walked over and sat across from James, his eyes studying him carefully, almost like he was searching for something he couldn't find. "I'm sorry for the way things went down," Matthews said, his voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "But I need you to explain something to me." James held his gaze, his expression unchanged. He wasn't about to speak yet. Not until he knew what was really going on. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with questions. The next few minutes would determine everything. Just as Matthews was about to speak again, a loud, urgent knock echoed through the door, interrupting the moment. Without waiting for a response, the door swung open and a suited man stepped in, his presence commanding. He didn't introduce himself, but immediately locked eyes with Matthews, his expression cold and serious. "That man," the suited man said, nodding toward James, "is not just anyone." Matthews froze, unsure of how to react. The tension in the room shifted, and suddenly, everything he thought he understood began to unravel. The suited man pulled out a badge from under his jacket, one Matthews didn't recognize. His pulse quickened. Who was this person, and what was he implying? James, however, didn't flinch. He had been waiting for this moment. He'd known something like this was coming. The suited man turned to him, acknowledging him with a nod, before speaking directly to Matthews. "You're dealing with someone much bigger than you can imagine," the man said, his tone now clipped and professional. "I suggest you stop digging. This could get out of hand fast." Matthews looked between them, feeling a knot tighten in his stomach. He had been in situations before that didn't feel right, but this felt like something out of a movie, a dangerous, high-stakes game he wasn't prepared for. Before Matthews could respond, the suited man turned to leave, but not before delivering one final, chilling statement. "Keep this quiet, or you'll regret it. You're not the only one watching." The door slammed shut behind him, leaving Matthews standing in stunned silence. The realization hit him like a freight train. This was far from a simple case of mistaken identity. He had unwittingly stepped into something much darker, and it was quickly spiraling out of control. Matthews stood frozen for a moment, still processing the suited man's words. His mind raced, but there was no more time to think. The door swung open once again, this time with even more urgency. Several officers rushed in, surrounding James, their hands on their weapons. Matthews immediately tensed, ready for a confrontation he wasn't sure he was prepared for. But then, in a blur of motion, something changed. James stood up calmly, his movements fluid, like a man who had already accepted what was about to happen. He glanced at Matthews, his eyes unwavering, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. James wasn't just some random CIA agent. He was someone much more influential, someone who operated on a level far beyond what Matthews had imagined. Before Matthews could say a word, James turned toward the officers, his voice cutting through the tension. "I think it's time you all knew the truth." The room fell silent as James casually reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, official-looking card. Matthew's eyes widened in disbelief. It was a top-level security clearance pass, one that only a select few had access to. The name on it was the same as the one on the badge the suited man had shown earlier. James wasn't just any CIA agent. He was a high-ranking operative, a key player in a much larger operation. Just as Matthews opened his mouth to speak, the suited man reappeared, but this time he wasn't alone. A group of men in dark suits followed him, their faces as unreadable as stone. They moved swiftly, taking control of the situation. Matthews watched, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. What had he just gotten himself into? Was his career, his life, even safe now? But then, in an unexpected turn, the suited man turned to Matthews one last time. "You made a mistake today, officer. But the story doesn't end here. We'll be in touch." With that, the door slammed shut, and the room went quiet. Matthews stood there, speechless. He had no idea what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. His world was never going to be the same. And somewhere in the shadows, the consequences of his actions were already beginning to unfold. As the officers filed out, one last detail hit Matthews like a thunderclap. The man he'd arrested. He wasn't just an agent. He was a key figure in something far bigger. And Matthews, unknowingly, had just crossed a line he might never be able to undo weeks past. And Matthews couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he stepped outside, every interaction felt like it was part of some larger game he hadn't been briefed on. The suited man's words echoed in his mind, and the events that followed haunted him. Despite the uneasy silence that surrounded him, Matthews tried to move on, focusing on his daily work. But something inside him had changed. He could no longer ignore the deeper implications of that day.